2:13.
Here we go. 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3.
Thank you, Mr. Bardwell. Thank you, Mrs. Leathercheck.
Thank you, Mrs. Worley.
Mrs. Garber.
Thank you, Mrs. Reed. Thank you, Mrs. B and Mrs. Little.
Thank you, Mr. Shively. Thank you, Mrs. Keebler. Thank you, Elvin. Thank you, Mrs. Sylvie Aker.
Thank you, Mr. Trout.
Thank you, Mrs. Tigner. Mrs. Bauman. Thank you, Mrs. Henderson.
Thank you, Mrs. Silverthorne.
Thank you, Mrs. Harder. Thank you, Mrs. Rinkenberg.
Thank you, Mr. Mulaney.
Thank you, Mr. Walker. Thank you, Mrs. Fraser. Thank you, Mrs. Finley. Thank you, Mrs. Mack. Thank you, Mrs. Bellini. Thank you, Officer Allen. Thank you, Mrs. Smitty. Mrs. Monfrey. Mrs. Bush. Thank you, Mrs. Clark. Thank you, Mrs. Gardner. Thank you, Mr. Stalter. Thank you, Mrs. Younger. Thank you, Mrs. Smith. Thank you, Mrs. Mooney. Thank you, Mrs. Dickinson. Thank you, Mrs. Griffin. Thank you, Mr. Hoggy. Thank you, Mrs. Locke. Thank you, Mrs. Moxley. Thank you, Mrs. Eastman.
Thank you, Mr. Roth.
Thank you, Mr. Eastman.
Thank you, Mrs. Ryder. Thank you, Mr. Knox.
Thank you, Mrs. Burtis.
Thank you, Mrs. Ayer. Thank you, Mrs. Selby. Thank you, Miss First. Thank you, Mrs. Yaz. Thank you, Miss James. Thank you, Mrs. Flusher. Thank you, Mrs. Ogg. Thank you, Mrs. Anderson. Thank you, Mrs. Bishop. Thank you, Mrs. Shoemaker. Happy Thanksgiving! Happy Thanksgiving! Merry Christmas! What? Alright, guys. What are you guys saying? It's Thanksgiving, not Christmas. Thanksgiving. Actually,